Good. Thank you very much for inviting me to share some thoughts on fiscal rules. Indeed, I have been involved in thinking about them in the context of the European Union. But I think that the lessons are more general. So I think that some of the lessons apply to Brazil, and I shall try to have this in mind as I go through the presentation. The first thing is to define what we mean by fiscal rules. I mean, there are all kinds of dimensions to fiscal policy. What I'm going to focus on, which I think is the topic of your conference, is on fiscal rules which are aimed at maintaining debt sustainability. There are other dimensions of fiscal policy, the composition of spending, the composition of taxes, and so on. I'm just not going to talk about this. The second point is how to define debt sustainability. And it fundamentally is a probabilistic concept. There is no such thing as debt sustainability with 100% certainty. It gets close to that in some countries, say Germany, for example. But it's clear that there's always a set of events which could happen, which would threaten debt sustainability. So the operational definition is basically debt is sustainable when there's a low probability, maybe 1%, 5% of debt explosion, sustained debt increases or debt to GDP ratio increases, followed by default, something that has happened in Latin America many times. So the challenge in thinking about fiscal rules in this context is that you want to keep that sustainable, low probability of explosion, but you want to leave space for using fiscal policy for stabilization, for macro stabilization. It's very easy to write rules which make that sustainable. For example, a balanced budget amendment, which forces every year the budget to be balanced, but we know that would be terrible from the point of view of fiscal stabilization. So the problem is to find the right way of thinking about sustainability with leaving as much space as possible for fiscal stabilization. So with this in mind, what is the issue? Well, the issue is basically we want to think about how debt is going to evolve over the next, say, 10 years. I think 50 years is a joke because we have no clue, and 1 or 2 years is too short. So I think realistically 5 to 10 years. And when you think about it, it depends on extremely many factors. It depends on the interest rate that you'll have to pay. It depends on the growth rate that you'll have to achieve. It depends on implicit liabilities. If you have a social security system which is in large deficit, then some money will have to come from the general budget, and this will show as a liability then. It depends on the nature of bondholders. If you have, say, Japanese bondholders in Japan, you can relax because they tend to really stay with the Japanese bonds. But if you're a country like Brazil, in which foreign investors play more of a role, then that introduces complications, dangers, which are not there otherwise. So when you think about it, it depends very much on what we call the first moments, the expected values of all these variables, but also very much on the second moments, the degree of uncertainty that we have about interest rate growth and so on. And so in that context, what is the economic approach that economists would take if they had to answer the question, is that sustainable? The technical answer is, it goes by the name of stochastic debt sustainability analysis, which is often reduced to SDSA. Debt sustainability analysis is the standard stuff. We've seen it in the context of external debt, probably of internal debt, just relies on expected values. But the important thing is the stochastic aspect, which is it's not good enough to be okay in expected values. You actually have to be okay even if the world is not as nice as you expected. So it depends very much on second moments, standard deviations of variables, correlations between variables. If G is high, will R be higher, and so on and so on. So I've given you a short description, which is probably familiar to many of you. And the conclusion is that this is an exercise which is messy. You have to make many assumptions. You do the best you can. and very complex. You have to think about uncertainty, basically the joint distribution of interest rate, growth rates, and so on in the future. The important point is, yes, it is messy, but not because the method is wrong, but because it is intrinsically a messy and difficult question. So it reflects the complex nature of the issue, not the methodology. And I think that's a really important point. And that sustainability is not a 0-1 thing that one thinks about and comes to strong conclusions. It's a very complicated question, which depends on many things. So as an economist, if you ask me, is Brazilian debt sustainable, then I would sit down, presumably with some of you, and then think about the distribution of all these variables, do the simulations, and come to the conclusion that on the existing or not. I'm not going to take a stance on Brazilian fiscal policy at this point, but this is very much an economist answer. And so the question is, well, in practice, what do you do? And that's the second slide I have, in which realistically, how do you basically put institutions in place which reflect that work? So I think the first point is, no matter what else you do, you set up an independent fiscal commission or an independent fiscal council, which basically does the technical job as convincingly, as honestly as it can. It shows what assumptions it takes and discusses whether they are reasonable and so on. And it comes with a conclusion, which is public, which is, well, we think that there is an issue, that sustainability is really not assured under our most plausible assumptions. And there can be discussions with the government, there can be discussions with other entities. But that's, I think, something absolutely essential to do. What I have found in the few times I've done this, not within a country, but at the IMF, is that the process of doing it generates the right discussions, which is, do we really think that, or is this right or wrong? And so even if in the end it doesn't play a major role, institutionally, I think it plays a major role in terms of discussions. Independence is clearly key. One big issue is how much power. So if you think of the EU, European Union Commission, then, potentially if a reform that the Commission is suggesting goes through, then the European Fiscal Commission, or the European Commission, would have quite a bit of say. That's to be decided. It can go from just recommendations, which would affect the market. So you have a very strong effect on how investors are going to think about it, or more, forcing the government to come back with a revised plan saying, well, this is how we basically think we can do better. And that's to be decided. I think that's an open issue. Other ways of dealing with the issues is the German way and the Maastricht way in Europe, which is you basically have hard numbers. Debt should go to 60%. Deficit should not exceed 3%. These are the so-called Maastricht numbers. And I think that's not the way to go. We can have this as references, that eventually it would be good in the long run if that did not exceed, I don't know for Brazil what it is, say 60%. But it shouldn't basically be forcing decisions. It is too dangerous, and that history of the European Union shows how dangerous it is when you have an economy which is very depressed and you force fiscal austerity, which is the case in 2010-11 in Europe. Then you get an output decline, you get a recession, and things turn out worse than they would otherwise. So I'm not at all in favor of hard numbers. I'm not against, for basically PR reasons or more than that, in having goals, but they should not, I think, be part of a package. Let me turn briefly to two other issues. Treatment of public investment. So I think the point there is that public investment should be treated in the debt sustainability analysis like any other sort of spending. And it should not get an automatic pass on debt finance. If public investment plausibly yields revenues for the state, then surely this will be taken into account and you can issue more debt, there's no question. If plausibly it increases the growth rate and therefore indirectly increases revenues for the state, then it's fine as well. And the DSA, or SDSA, will basically say, yes, you can finance part of public investment with debt finance. But if public investment, for example, makes growth better in the sense of less CO2, but doesn't increase the growth rate, may actually decrease it, and doesn't yield revenues, so it's not a carbon tax, which would yield revenues, then there's no reason to treat it differently from a debt sustainability analysis as any different from paying, teachers. So it doesn't take an automatic pass on debt finance. Does this mean that there should not be the right level of public investment? No, it means that you should do the right level of public investment, but how you finance it, whether you finance it through debt or through taxes, is what is the open issue. And it depends on the revenues yielding back to the state. In that context, there has been a lot of discussion about having a separate current account and a capital account for the state. Current account would be current expenses, capital account would be investment. And I think that's a useful direction to explore. I had a paper many years ago with Francesco Giavazzi in which we thought very hard about it and proposed one way of doing it. It is, I think, very useful as a PR transparency device. It shows, how much you're investing for the future. It can be misused. For example, you can argue, a government can argue that the salaries of the public school teachers are investment, and therefore they go into a capital account. There has to be very strict rules about what's defined as investment and not. And again, no pass for automatic debt finance on the capital account. It cannot be. But I think that's something that would be very useful to have in place. I have no clue as to whether Brazil has anything like that, but it would be useful. And then the last point I would make is that we've talked about fiscal rules, but there's, I think, fundamental issues with the budget process, which is how is it organized, who presents the budget first, can there be amendments which increases spending without having to increase taxes and so on. And there you can have all kinds of budget rules, which are not the same as what I referred to earlier, which is which way, for example, if you introduce a new expenditure program, it has to be automatically financed by taxes unless there's a good reason. And I think that historically, things like this have worked. I have not worked on it as much as I have worked on what I talked about until now, but I think that's part of the deal. So if I were to summarize and to conclude, I would say have an independent fiscal commission. I think that's really an essential part of, and having it do a stochastic debt sustainability analysis. It should probably find a more attractive name for it, but it should do something like this. Have a discussion there and then think hard about the rules for the budget process. But on this, I do not feel I have expertise. So I'm very sorry that I could not participate in your conference live. I had commitments on those days, but I hope that I contribute a bit to the discussion. I'd be very happy to know what comes out in the end. Thank you very much.